Hey there, this is Troy Yamaguchi for Eclipse TCG, and today is our weekly meta update for the week of May 4th. The Eclipse team has been to several Star Wars events back to back to back, and I'm feeling a little bit under the weather from what I'm terming the Palm Springs debuff, but I wanted to put together this weekly meta update for the Premier format, targeting some of the upcoming majors occurring in Europe. I think it's pretty interesting. These late format events typically lend themselves well to good preparation and a good understanding of the format just because more of the answers are out there already, and it becomes more of a question of picking and refining from what's available. Um, you're definitely guessing a lot less as to what will be in the room and decks' relative strengths into one another by this point in the format. You have just not only more data, but just more experience playing the game with a given card pool by this point. So I think these late format events are pretty interesting and definitely warrant a good discussion. So we're going to be targeting these. The London sector is upcoming this weekend, and we're going to talk as well about the Prague sector at the end of the month. So that's what's on the agenda today. In addition, I wanted to talk about just some of the ways we can go about refining our ideas about a format. This will constitute a little bit more of like an abstract theory discussion as to how it is that we take known information from a format and try to figure out, how to position ourselves even better and come to new solutions, even using what's already available to us and some of the information that we have already. So in terms of upcoming events, like I said, the London sector is this weekend, so that will be the emphasis of this video. But if you're in Europe and you're planning to attend later the Prague Regional, this is really the kind of more exciting event. It's bigger, it has more unique prizings. The Champion Luke Skywalker looks awesome. So this will be kind of the event that we're really thinking about, but I don't want to discredit the London sector as well. This is a major, it's still important. So we'll try to use the information that we have this week with mostly some of the downstream effects from some of the developments in Atlanta to get to this sector that's this coming weekend, and then target later down the road for the Prague Regional, make some wider claims about the format in general. So, elephant in the room, downstream effects of the Atlanta sector, breakout deck, Lando Lake Country. I think that the past 2 weeks of even just PQ results, even though PQ results are sometimes neither here nor there, I think there's been no evidence yet to suggest that this deck is still not the best thing to be doing in the room. There are a couple of ideas that people have been generating in the works, and these are looking pretty strong. We'll definitely be talking about some of the answers that you can start to form to Lando Lake Country, and some of the ways to attack this deck, attack the format, and the assumptions you have to verify in so doing. But just in terms of raw matchup spread, just in terms of raw win weight, performance, it still continues to win events, even though it's now a known quantity. I think this deck is just I don't want to say head and shoulders above everything else, but it's a very valid strategy. It's very powerful. It's very consistent, and it has no like super exploitable weaknesses, even though that will constitute some of the discussion today as well. Everything else in tier 1, though, is still looking pretty good. I put a power gap between Lando and the next couple decks in tier 1, but I still do consider these decks pretty good. I would consider these 3 decks kind of the main pillars of the format. Obi-Wan, Blue Force, and Boba Lake Country are still pretty good decks. I think Obi-Wan is definitely a little bit above Boba Lake Country, and I'll talk about how Obi-Wan kind of determines where a lot of the other decks are positioned in the format. But these are the 3 kind of big dogs in the room going into London, and a lot of the metagame is going to be centered around how you're responding to these 3 threats, or checking to make sure that your answer to one of them is not just like throwing to the others, checking to make sure that your answer to one of these is still good into the rest of the field, because Star Wars Unlimited is usually a wide metagame. I mean, we saw it at Atlanta. It was like 14% Boba, 14% Obi-Wan, maybe it was a little switch. Obi-Wan was like 15% day 1 or something like that. But then after that, it was just like 4%, 5%, 5%, 5%, just like, a totally wide spread of decks of people just bringing whatever it was they decided to play. I think London will be a little more solidified just because Atlanta was the first major of a new format, of a new rotation, of a new card pool. There are a lot of questions as to what was good, a lot of kind of conflicting opinions on the approach to the metagame, but I think a lot of these will kind of be worked out by the time London and especially Prague comes around. So I would expect the format to be at least a little more centralized. I would expect Lando Lake Country to be, a 15% representation deck. Obi-Wan will still be pretty high representation, but after that, it'll probably taper down. Boba Fett, maybe more around, along the 9-10% type range. And from there, you'll start seeing your 5%, 5%, 6%, whatever type decks. But in general, all this to say, the tier 1 decks are, I think, pretty solidified to me. it's not as though there's not room for a good answer to come up to replace that. But going into London, this would be the known information and kind of the starting point for some of the questions that we'll ask ourselves. And again, we'll talk about how to approach that and how to develop these into broader claims on the meta just in a bit right here. But let's get through the rest of the room. Tier 2, kind of the downstream effect of Obi-Wan being like a top 2 deck or even like a top 1 deck in terms of representation is that aggressive negotiations is pretty put out. This strategy was the kind of like weak -1 play that most people were running towards. It was defining the metagame, and that's what led to the development of Boba Fett Lake Country, which then kind of became the better aggressive strategy. But in general, a lot of the aggressive negotiation strategies are pretty put out by the bigger HP Obi-Wan build that has more restore, more just base HP, a little more fight back in the game. So that's kind of like one defining trend in the med game. All this to say, kind of despite expectations, or maybe not despite expectations, we've kind of tracked Yularen's rise through the tier lists on these meta reports. It started off in Rogue. We made mention like, hey, this is like one of the better kind of like unexpected decks that people are playing. It crept up into tier 2. We said, this deck actually has quite a bit of push. And as it turns out, this is, I think, the most commonly played aggressive negotiation strategy for the past 2 weeks and has a pretty good matchup spread. It still is losing into Obi-Wan recently, and I think that stands true. Craving Power can only do so much. Your little units still do not fight very well on the 3R and 4R turns against Obi-Wan's, just balls of stats, plenty of Sentinels, plenty of things to be doing. But in general, this deck is pretty strong into the rest of the field. I think this deck has a pretty valid matchup against Lando Lake Country and has a pretty good matchup against Boba Lake Country. So Yularen looks pretty good into the rest of the room, and in terms of an aggressive negotiation strategy, seems to be a pretty good choice overall, though you still have your Obi-Wan problem, and for that reason I can't put it any much higher than this. I think Obi-Wan is still, like I said, a top 2 deck, even like a top 1 representation deck. But Yularen definitely deserves his praise. He's kind of, clawed his way all the way up here and is a totally valid choice that you should expect to face if you're going to London, I would say. Maybe expect to face is a little bit much, but like I would not be surprised to see this being just the most represented aggressive negotiation strategy at Yularen and just suck up a lot of meta share from like the Vels and the Jinns and, all these other kind of like by the wayside aggressive negotiation strategies that were more in line with like a weak -1 approach. So he's definitely on the radar for sure. Another new deck that is very notable and something that should be absolutely remarked upon is the development of Aurra Data Vault. This is a response to Lando Lake Country. The 2R and 3R plays that this deck has available to it match very, very well into Lando's 2R and 3R plays. So you kind of shut down their early snowball and they have to push their game plan back onto 4R, 5R, 6R, makes it much more difficult for this deck just to run you over, which is what it plans to do in general. So we'll be talking a lot about how this matchup dynamic plays out. This is something that we're paying a lot of attention to as people that are just interested in both of these decks, actually. So plenty of analytical content down the line for her in particular, but this deck is pretty cool. It's kind of just like a greedy mid-range deck, it is pretty much in line with what blue-green villain has been in the past. Has multi-card turns down the road, just trying to stabilize, and then just play kind of higher quality creatures. But as I said, the 2R and 3R plays in this deck are pretty well matched up into a lot of things people are doing. So this deck is pretty good and is a newcomer onto the field. The way it plays is just more like a taller mid-range strategy. In the blue-green villain wheelhouse, and pretty similar to Aurra, is the Admiral Piett blue approach. We'll talk a little bit more about the differences between these two down the road, but it's a pretty similar strategy. It's a little more linear than Aurra and is doing something a little more specific than Aurra Sing is, which means I like it a little bit less, but still kind of same game plan of be a little bit greedier than some of the other decks in the room, and your 2R and 3R plays are, actually pretty threatening as it turns out. So Piett in the same wheelhouse, some of the same advantages, but we'll get into the matchup specifics after the theory component. Talzin is a little bit better positioned than I would have thought, which is kind of interesting. Mostly her advantages this format are from the decline in space. I think she really likes that Luke is no longer like a super popular deck. Well, I say that. It will still see play, but I think it will, like Boba Fett's on the downtrend, and I think Boba Fett had already sucked up a good amount of meta share from Luke. So anyway, Talzin likes that in general. Talzin also really likes that Obi-Wan is a good deck. I think that the yellow build beats up on Obi-Wan. I think it's a favorable matchup. So all of these things in conjunction, I think this leader is actually better positioned going into London than she was going into Atlanta. Of course, this is contingent on like further metagame developments. I don't think she loves to play against the taller blue-green villain strategies, so maybe that's like another knock against Talzin, but a little bit more positive things to say about Talzin going into London than I had going into Atlanta, even though I still don't think she's like a super, super great pick to try to win the event. This deck is still like pretty powerful, doing something pretty unique. And then finally at the end of tier 2 here, we have Luke. I still am of the opinion that this is inferior to Boba Fett Lane Country. I don't really understand what matchup advantages you're getting from Luke. It did top at Atlanta, but I think, I spectated the games. Dylan had a pretty disastrous like variance moment game 1 against Luke, and then game 3 there was an angle to win, but there was a sequencing error that was made which allowed Luke into top cut. So anyway, even just taking those results and contrasting them against just my general theory opinions, I still don't think this deck is very good, but it is still a space strategy that exists, and I expect some people to play it, even though I don't really personally see the advantages you're receiving over Boba Fett Lane Country. But maybe that's me missing something. Definitely could be the case as well. Finally, over here in the rogue category, this is where a lot of the aggressive negotiation decks are unfortunately slanted. I think that these decks are pretty bad into Obi-Wan in general, and even Lando like has pretty good lines to take into them. Chewbacca is still like one of the better ones for sure. Maybe he deserves to be put up here in tier 2, but there's kind of just not space. There's too many decks in this game. So I slanted him down here in rogue. I think it makes sense from a theory perspective. I think that this deck's win rates over the past 2 weeks do not look very good. And what it's doing is, like, once people are prepared for Chewbacca, and once people just know just to take the Wookiee out, and then, like, you will find a way to stabilize pretty much no matter what deck you're playing, I think his win rate goes down dramatically. So Chewbacca, unfortunately, I think is still rogue. I think it's still, like, a deck that is competitive. I still think that it's a deck that's powerful and doing something okay, but in terms of metagame position, I don't love it. I don't love aggressive negotiations in general, and I think that a lot of the kind of surprise factor or oomph that you got initially has been diffused by this point. Tobias as well, in a different metagame, I'd still, maybe I'm a coper, but like I still do believe that this deck could be tier 1. It's pretty good in the space. It's good in the other aggressive decks. It's just clicking a lot of buttons. I like all of these things together, but man, this guy just... I do not think he can beat Obi-Wan, and that is just where he's going to have to live. And as long as Obi-Wan is top 1 or 2 deck, I just have to put this guy pretty far down on the tier list. May have definitely overestimated him going into Atlanta, but I think maybe that's just undervaluing Obi-Wan's position going into that format. So going to London, I would definitely not really recommend playing Tobias. You're making like a pretty specific call that Obi-Wan will be faded, when I don't think that Obi-Wan is the #1 boogeyman of the format at all. Other rogue decks, so Dedra Colossus has been seeing an uptick in play, and I think this is like a kind of like this control idea, this like single reactor deck idea, is a response to Lando Lake Country. It's a little bit weird. It sounds weird, right? Because it's a Faith in Your Friends deck. So like you're thinking to yourself, how does my control deck beat Faith in Your Friends? But the red kind of cards do contribute quite a bit to just answering Faith. Collateral damage goes 1-for-1 with Faith. I mean, they get the draw, but they don't get their board. Like that's kind of acceptable. You will get cards back over the course of game with your Dedra ability. So these things are both good. You can have more copies of collateral damage in your deck than they have copies of Faith. You can have also Let's Call It War, which does the same thing. So this deck does have like counterplay into Faith and can just try to grind them out. And the matchups from the past 2 weeks look pretty good for Dedra into Lando Calrissian, but this deck's matchups into the other tier 2 or tier 1 decks do not look very good. So in general, I do not like control. I do not think this deck has been very good for a long time in this game's history. I think that just #1, the metagame is very wide, that picking kind of like a specific assassin strategy is generally not a great idea. So that's like #1 thing. But the fact that this deck also has suspicious positioning into Obi-Wan and especially Boba Fett makes me really not like Dedra, and we'll talk about that more in a bit. Of course, down here in Rogue is Darth Vader. This guy is still just a terrorist deck, I fear. You just beat up on Obi-Wan, but unfortunately the rest of this tier list kind of smokes you, so Not a great pick in my opinion. People will still play it regardless, but if you're Obi-Wan, I think that's something that you just have to accept. Like, I don't really know what there is to be doing. This is not a deck that I would really expect to make a deep run in the tournament. But it is still like a competent strategy with cards in it. And then finally here in the rogue category is Qui-Gon Jinn. This is the kind of like happy, get to click buttons and do combos, greedy force deck. This deck is really cool. It's doing the most interesting things probably on this entire tier list. I don't really understand what its favorable matchups or like conditions to be good are. Its matchup data looks horrible across the board. It has like a 40% win rate in general. Since Atlanta just doesn't beat anything in the higher echelons of the tier list. So there's like an argument that it's a piloting issue. There's an argument that's a familiarity issue, but I'm not a huge believer in Qui-Gon. I think that there are other like better, like not just force strategies to be playing, but also just like better greedy and taller like mid-rangey strategies to be playing. But I always have to give it props. Like, this deck is cool. It's doing something interesting. But anyway, that's kind of the decks in the room summed up. I want to talk a little bit more about how we're approaching this London format in particular, with the expectation that Lando is like, I still think it's the best deck in the room. I think it's the best deck in the room by a good margin as well. And I think that's in line with a lot of other opinions at the moment. So how do we go about approaching this sector with this kind of newer deck that we're going to have to expect to beat? This is a deck that has only been kind of in the spotlight for a couple of weeks, so we haven't had a ton of time to get a ton of information on it. So how do we start forming our opinions on addressing the threat and coming up with our own answer to beat it? Do we just play this deck? Do we try to, finagle some kind of like interesting counter? What's the best way to go about this in a metagame? And to get to this idea, I want to give this framework of what I'm calling the innovation process. In general, there's like two states, I guess, that information exists in these types of games. The first is like the known meta. This is common opinion. This is things that people expect to be good. These are things that you hear on the internet. These are things that your friends tell you. These are things that you can verify just by playing online. And then there's new solutions. These are things that you are constantly trying to produce. These things are being produced in a lot of the same arenas. There's a lot of online discussion forums. There's a lot of, maybe you're just out your locals and you're talking amongst your friends on like, well, what do you think is really good into Boba Lake Country? And they say this, and that, and you have to evaluate that information and come to your own conclusions. So these are the two types of informations that exist in a format. The easiest way to think about this is if we're playing a rock, paper, scissors tournament and you just happen to know for whatever reason that 70% of people in this room will just always throw rock 100% of the time. Well, then it's pretty obvious your strategy going into this tournament is just throw paper, unless you have a crazy soul read that your opponent is 30% of the room and is going to throw scissors. You would probably just wander up to a random opponent and throw paper at them. The interesting thing about games, though, is that it's never quite this simple. So with rock, paper, scissors, obviously, every time you throw rock and your opponent plays paper, you lose. And every time your opponent plays rock and you play paper, they lose. But games are a little bit more complex than this. There's a little bit more verification that needs to go into these things when we're trying to validate, my idea of like, if I expect the tournament in the room to look a certain way, what is my appropriate response? And that's where a lot of the rub comes in. So the way that I try to explain this is when you get to a game that's any more complex than rock, paper, scissors, you have to make, more complicated evaluations. So like, let's just say, for example, like the meta in the room is like water, rock, right? But your approach to the meta is going to be paper, fire. Like, obviously paper is good against rock, but water is good against fire. So where does that shake out in terms of your strategy's quality relative to the threat you're trying to address, right? That's a lot of what testing comes down to, and that's a lot of what trying to balance your approach to a metagame ends up being, is shaking out the various plus and minus to all the various decisions that you're going to be making, whether that's a card decision, whether that's choosing what archetype to bring in general, and just trying to figure out where all of these different percentages lie is where the evaluation of the format comes in. We have resources available to you. You have people talking about the game online. You have a pretty robust range of statistics that are available through platforms like Swoobase. So when you're trying to analyze a format, these are the different things that you're trying to keep in mind is how am I responding to the format? What are my assumptions? And what is my ability to verify that my responses to the format are appropriate and valid, right? Is this example of water, rock, and fire, paper, what is more important? Is the rock more relevant or is the water more relevant, right? It's a little bit abstract, but approaching a metagame is a lot of different questions along that line. And it gets even more complicated when you start throwing in multiple factors and having to balance all of the different strategies that other people will be trying to do. Because, gaming is a communal phenomena, right? Everyone else is doing the same thing too. You're not the only one that has access to Swoobase. You're not the only one watching people talk about Star Wars Unlimited online, right? So as you're hurtling towards an event, you have 1,500. If it's just your locals, you have 16 people all trying to do the same thing and trying to get one up on each other. So how do you evaluate your strategy in comparison to everyone else's kind of new approach to the format and synthesize the most acceptable solution? That's what really makes games and metagaming in particular really interesting, and that's something that I love, and I think it's just an awesome way just to exercise creativity and risk reward and decision making. It's just a really fun process in general. So I talked about how we have to validate that our solutions to a format are appropriate, that they work. It's a little more complicated than just saying, does rock beat paper every single time? Or sorry, does paper beat rock every single time? Even if you expect that your paper will beat your opponent's rock, you still have to verify that and understand why that's the case. And that occurs during testing. If we say something like Lando Lake Country has a favorable matchup into Obi-Wan Blue Force, we have to know why that's the case, what game actions are conducive to that. We have to be able to articulate that just to make sure that we understand what it is about our deck that is addressing the room and what are the beneficial qualities to our strategy. So that all comes during the testing process. And part of this constant validation is that if your testing is good, if the way that you connect your solutions to the known meta is good, then your new solutions will become the known meta because they will succeed, right? That's a lot of it is the proof is in the pudding, and over a long enough span of time, with enough events, with enough people playing, you will eventually come to some sort of conception of the correct answer, which is an interesting idea because the correct answer is always conditional. If the room is 70% rock, the correct answer is to bring paper, right? But if the room is now 70% scissors next week, if you bring your paper strategy, you're going to get farmed, right? So this is the whole crux of the innovation process. I think that when it comes to adapting to a metagame, when it comes to trying to take in new ideas, this is the framework that I personally use. Maybe not always officially, but this is how I go about trying to think about the game, and I think it's the best conception that I've been able to come up with so far. So with all this in mind, I just want to talk a little bit about the role of internet punditry in the innovation process, and just be very concrete and transparent about what the role of these metagame reports is, and some of my assurances and boundaries in terms of the information that is provided. So first things first, I will never tell you anything that I don't 100% believe. I will not lie. I will not manipulate the metagame. This is just not something that I want under my name. It's literally my full name is at the start of every video. My face is on the internet. Keeping your name good in these communities is crucial. It's a small world. I've had people come up to me from other games that have literally just seen me at a Star Wars event. They don't play Star Wars. They were just in the room for another tournament or know a judge or a friend of a judge. The integrity of our information is, paramount. It's the most important thing. So in terms of what these meta reports will always be my genuine opinions or the team's genuine opinions on the format and the conclusions that we're deriving from known meta information. But the boundary here is that I can only speak so much beyond things like win rate, play rate, and in-game interactions, because anything other than that has not been verified, and anything other than that is subject to my own personal testing or the team's conclusion on the format. And the last thing that I want is for our conclusions to be wrong and to have sold someone a false bill of goods saying that this deck is broken and that this deck will become the new meta, and like, you know, sensationalist garbage like that. Like, all I want is to give a concrete explanation of the format the way that I see it, and to help any viewer or anybody that is interested in thinking about the game from an analytical perspective, help them come to their own conclusions, which is like a cliche, and I hate it because it's always used in like a, you know, shisty kind of way, but like really that is the goal here. And you're just gonna have to take my word for it. Is that if I give the same information to somebody else that I'm seeing in the format, it kind of accelerates this innovation process and gets the game to a more interesting state. Like, I just want to see what other people will come up with, and by giving people the information and some of the format questions that we're seeing, I think it helps the team. I think it just helps the entire game in general just kind of accelerate towards this idea of a correct solution. I don't know. I think that process is so interesting. I think that the way that it expresses problem solving is just fascinating. Like this like idea of a crowdsourced problem. It's just so cool. So anyway, that is the role of these meta reports. It's, you know, to give you the win rate, play rate, you know, concrete brass tacks of like what is the known meta, because that's just the step one, is just like understanding what world you live in, and then to start giving kind of some of the analysis as like, where do we go next, what are we testing, what is interesting, you know, what are some of the, you know, possible solutions to this problem, right? And so the elephant in the room is that we all took a new deck, Lando Lake Country, a deck that had not been like verified necessarily to Atlanta. I mean, it performed at a PQ immediately preceding Atlanta, but like this was an idea that we had cooking for just not even that long before that. It was like only a week before that tournament that we even found this idea. So like, why do I not mention this during this meta report? Well, it's because it's not known meta information at the time. I don't have any verification that this idea was good. There's like absolutely a world where like we come to this conclusion that like this deck is good, we all take it to Atlanta, and we just all blow up because our testing was bad or some of our assumptions about the format were bad. So rather than give my conclusion to the format, I would prefer to describe the known meta information and some of the questions that are being addressed. If you go watch the pre-Atlanta recap, everything that I expressed was my genuine opinion, and I think for the most part pretty accurate. The only misses is that I perhaps over-evaluated Boba Lake Country's eventual success and power, but like a lot of the format approach I think still holds. You know, space was a considerable threat in the room. Obi-Wan was incredibly up on the rise and was like a major contender to be considered. You know, I think all of that was appropriate given where we're going into Atlanta. And so that's what we'll continue to do. I want to continue to give, you know, information about the format and lay out some of the questions that we're all attempting to answer when we're trying to solve these problems. So now that Lando Lake Country has become, you know, new known meta information that has been verified, right? The question then becomes, as we go into London and as we approach Prague, how do we tackle this new piece of information, and how do we kind of prompt the next cycle in the meta until all information is out there, all valid strategies are out there? And what are some of the ways that we're approaching this new world that we live in a post-Atlanta format? And of course, after London, we'll live in a post-London format. And then after Prague, we'll live in a post-Prague format. But there will be no more majors to test for. So the incentive to continue to think about this format, you know, goes down drastically, especially as we approach Galactics. But anyway, that's how this process works. And so now that Lando Lake Country is the known meta, I want to take a perspective on this as, you know, how do we defeat the deck that, you know, just kind of came into being? How good is this strategy? Is it the final stop? Is this just the best deck in the room, you know, full stop? This, you know, with this card pool is the best thing that you can be doing? Or is there like yet another level to this stuff? And like, is there yet another new solution to be found? So that's kind of the crux of this discussion going forward. I think that as we approach London format, I still do think that this is the boogeyman. I think this is the best deck in the room. I think that Obi-Wan is the secondary contender, but still incredibly valid and like cannot be discounted. And Boba Fett is like kind of running up the rear here as like maybe something that you could try to fade the event, or maybe make a call that this deck is like not as good as has been to this point. But this is kind of the positioning of the known meta, and that's what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this video. So as we approach London, my questions and requirements for a deck, if I were playing this event, would be that my deck is just good to the known answers, obviously, Lando Lake Country, and that it's playable into Obi-Wan 28 Force. I think that this deck is of secondary consideration, but still should be very major. If my deck is just not playable whatsoever into this, or if like I don't feel super confident in the matchup, I would not be very happy to be playing whatever deck that I choose as for my solution. The questions that I have are pretty much centered around Boba's position and like whether or not this deck will be played at this event, and whether or not it is even like that broken of a strategy to be fearing. I think that Boba was a gatekeeper in the more race-centric format, but now that we're living in more of like a tempo and like taller mid-range type of environment, this deck's constraints that it places on the metagame are a little bit loosened. So I'm interested to see how decks perform into Boba Lake and what the representation and success will look like at this upcoming event. It didn't do very well at the last major, which definitely makes it less of a consideration. Good players also typically have like a mental block against Boba Lake Country. Like they just refuse to play the deck because it is, presents as like pretty linear, and it's pretty linear. It's mostly just like an aggressive hit based like Sabine type strategy, and so the players that play this deck, players typically tend to avoid it for whatever reason. Even if it were the best deck in the room, I think you would still have players that like just refuse to play it. So all these things in conjunction make me just wonder, what is this deck's position as we go into this event? And just finally, the last consideration is just always like a sanity check that we have to do, is that if we end up taking like another idea to this tournament, do I just randomly lose to all of these other decks that are in the room as well? Does that mean my strategy is too specific? Does that mean that my strategy is like not inherently powerful enough? I feel this way a little bit about control, of just like there are just so many like random matchups that you end up losing when you pick control as a strategy. So that's like my general reason for disliking the archetype, although in context it's always different and it's never like quite that simple. So I want to talk about the different answers that people have taken to this Lando Lake Country, Obi-Wan, and Boba Fett format. These were included on the tier list, and I want to go into their like specific matchup positioning during this section. So first off is this blue-green villain, like taller mid-range idea. The two decks that are represented here are Aurra DV and Piett Blue. So in the matchup data, and I think in my personal experience as well, both these decks are pretty good into Boba Fett. Aurra has, plenty of event-based removal to go 1-for-1 with the ships, and you have enough HP to not get burned out, and can eventually create some kind of like tempo advantage with your leader flip and some kind of multi-card removal turn. You can stick Condemn on their leader, kind of neutralizes that card. You also have big spaceships of your own to go fight into space, later resources of the game. So this deck is pretty good into Boba Fett. I want to say that the stats are like incredibly dominant over the past 2 weeks. It was something ridiculous at some point. It was like 22 wins and 5 losses or something like that. So that's pretty remarkable. So this deck is pretty well positioned. It's also very good in Lando. So this is kind of the real reason to be investigating this Aurra Sing strategy, is that its 2R and 3R plays line up really incredibly into all of Lando's 2R and 3R's plays. So you cut off their snowball at the pass, and then from there, you kind of are just attempting to out mid-range them, deprive them of tempo, keep them from accomplishing very much. And then eventually, like, your units are bigger, you have like more real removal for their bombs. So altogether, like a lot of good things are occurring in this matchup. But the question mark that I have is how well this deck is positioned into Obi-Wan. The matchup data looks a little bit shaky. It has something to the tune of like a 40 to 45% win rate over the last 2 weeks. The reason for this is I think it's because Aurra is, again, it's not a control deck. Please, I hate the term self-control. Blue-green villain has typically been just a tall bomb-based mid-range strategy. And like, historically has like not really loved like the other like more efficient mid-range strategies. It's a little bit strange. Like the Hantu Blue matchup, well, when Force Throw was around, like was not very good. After Force Throw was around, I think it got better. I think Kira like was ultimately favored into Hantu Blue, but that was mostly an artifact of Ogdo Bogdo. But that doesn't matter. That's like not this format. In this format, this like taller mid-range idea, because your mid-range tools are so much worse, because your removal is like pretty inefficient in these colors, and because your units are like a little bit like, they're kind of just speed bumps, they're not like doing a whole lot proactively. In theory, I don't expect this Aurra Sing deck to do very well into Obi-Wan, just because the Obi-Wan deck is just a little bit more efficient. Its units are just a little bit higher quality, and you just have the Force engine. Your leader comes on, a little bit earlier. All these things in conjunction have me doubting Aurra Sing's ability to like consistently or favorably win against Obi-Wan. But that's a question that I have about the format. Again, the matchup data is favored for Obi-Wan, but there are questions we have as to like how much counterplay exists in the matchup, and that's exactly what we were going into. So we have all these questions as to Aurra's position within the format, and with the release of our new METAFY, I now have the ability to make some of our team's internal testing VODs public. We have the support to do so, and we have the distribution to do so. And this week we'll be focusing on Aurra Sing's matchup, specifically Obi-Wan. I have a feeling that this is likely the most problematic matchup for this deck, and especially the most problematic, good, and popular deck. So if Aurra Sing can find a way around Obi-Wan for this upcoming London event, I have a feeling this deck will be here to stay. It will be very popular and will be a very good pick for this event. So these are all things that we need to verify, however. I talked earlier about how when you have questions about the format, testing is the way that you come to your conclusions and just verify that your opinion is correct. So anyway, these VODs will be headed by our most recent sector champion, Dylan Sumner. So please check out the METAFY if you want to continue this discussion and to view the results of those testing. The link is, of course, in the description. Other than this, the other blue-green villain deck in the room is Admiral Piett. And the matchups up and down that this deck receives are pretty similar. So it's also good into Boba Fett. I talked in the pre-Atlanta video about how your ships just bully theirs. This remains to be true. This deck is pretty good into Boba Fett. It's also pretty good into Obi-Wan. Your Turbo Laser Salvo is a house against their deck. It's pretty difficult for them to remain in the game. Your units are pretty big, and you can put on pressure. And as we've mentioned probably a couple of times over the course of these reports, the Obi-Wan deck does struggle to draw removal, so eventually one of your threats will stick, and you will be able to ride that out into winning the game. Unfortunately, this deck is probably not very good into Lando. It hasn't had a ton of games into that deck, but like Commandeer is just horrifying for you, and just the general like aggressive tempo strategy. The Piett deck does not have quite as much interaction as Aurra. It doesn't have the bigger Sentinels as well. It's weaker into something like Rose. So for all of these reasons, at least compared to Aurra, and probably just overall in general, it has less percent into Lando. And as a linear strategy, as a more like, I don't want to say limited because that makes me sound like I'm downplaying the deck, but the strategy is just simply more limited in terms of like what the cards accomplish and the scope of what the deck is trying to do. These things also, I think, make it weaker into the tier 2 strategies. You don't have quite as much agency sometimes as you would like, because, I mean, you're just like running out the biggest thing in your hand, and like that is essentially like the crux of your strategy. So all these things in combination make me lean definitely more towards Aurra than Piett. But in terms of the answers, if your testing has verified otherwise, I think Piett is in a similar lane as Aurra as for the approach of the format. And I think these are both two pretty valid strategies to be looking into to try to find something new to take to London. If none of like the obvious top 3 strategies in tier 1 are quite doing it for you, or you don't feel confident in them, I think this is like another avenue definitely to be approaching the game at. So that's one discussion of a new idea that people have been tackling recently to try to address the known meta and try to get a leg up on the competition. I want to talk a little bit about some of the other solutions that have been tried recently, and say why I may have listed them lower on the tier list and some of their issues. The first one here is Dedra Control. I do see the angle of this leader over something like the Aurra Sing red idea. The data does suggest this deck is better into Lando and is quite favored into Lando, and I see the angle on that for sure. Your leader ability is more active. It's pretty frequently online. It matches up pretty well into a lot of their stats. They have a lot of like X4 units. Of course, you can point out a spy and like threaten it. Like this is all good. So this is where Dedra gets some points. I would still want to verify this just because, personally, I just have so little confidence into Control, into like good players, and into like pilots that have played the deck for a while and are expecting you. So even though Lando looks good in the data and like has some basis in theory as well, if I were to take this to an event, which I probably wouldn't, but if I was a control freak and like this is just the deck that I loved and this is the deck I wanted to bring, I would still just want to verify that like this deck actually does beat Lando, which is the good matchup that we're expecting. You know, it's just part of the innovation process. But all this aside, let's just put Lando to the side for now. I don't think that Dedra Control is a very good answer to the format. And the reason for that is like you still need to get through the other tier 1 decks. And I don't think this deck is good into them whatsoever. Boba Fett is just a burn strategy. Like you will just get rolled off the map and you might have 35 HP, but like that number starts looking real small after Fire Spray, Devastator. You know, it's like they will eventually get there. And this is supported in the matchup data. It looks pretty doomed for Dedra. Your deck just like doesn't generate the activity that it needs against them. So that's mark number 1. Mark number 2 is that like Obi-Wan is also like not a fantastic matchup. Like Yularen is a house of a card. That card scales for the entirety of the game and will eventually allow them to stick a unit. Like you will just run out of enough single reactor ignitions to keep clear of the board, and they will connect with your base. And like God forbid that an Obi-Wan player actually expect that Dedra Miro is in the room on the basis that it's good in the Lando Calrissian and just decide to play Rey Skywalker in their deck, and like all of a sudden like now you need a very specific answer to their specific answer. Like it just, the matchup has to be chalked. Well, has to be, that's a very strong term. The matchup seems quite chalked, or at least does not seem like it's very favorable to me. But could be the case that through enough testing, this one could get into the, like, I feel more confident that Obi-Wan is a solvable problem for Dedra than Boba. But again, the issue is that like you need to also account for the idea that like, they might prepare for you and they might put Rey Skywalker in the deck. Like too many question marks for this matchup for me to feel very confident in Dedra Control, in addition to just like my personal bias against this deck in general. So anyway, this is an answer that can be taken to London. I think it's one that people will take to London just because, you know, it's an archetype of play. Like people just like control leaders. They just like control decks. But for these reasons, based on what I know right now from the known meta information that we have, these would be some of the questions and some of the like pretty reasonable doubts. Well, I say reasonable. Of course they're reasonable. They're my opinions. All of my opinions are reasonable. But like just some of the doubts that I would have for this strategy. And if I were taking it to a tournament or recommending it to a friend, this is like some of the questions that I would be encouraging them to think about. Finally, some of the more aggressive answers. If you're trying to take an aggressive answer to London, your question always just has to be like how you're positioned in Obi-Wan, because Obi-Wan is like the mid-range stonewall to aggressive decks. And the positions of these decks are pretty interesting. So Yularen is awful into Obi-Wan. Win rate does not look good. Theory does not look good. I don't know if you can beat them. Like, I don't know if this is a solvable problem. Like, I think it's just chalked. Like your 2R and 3R plays are just weaker than theirs and will get traded eventually. And then like Sentinel will come on 4 and like it just doesn't look very good. So this might just be something that you have to accept as Yularen. Like you can try to finagle a way around it, but I'm not convinced that it can be done. So if you're taking Yularen to a tournament, you're kind of making the call that like Obi-Wan is a fraudulent deck or just like will not see play because, you know, maybe it's weak in the Lando Lake Country, which I think it is, but those are the type of things that you're considering for Yularen. The benefit that this has as an answer into the London format is that this deck looks pretty like human into everything else, and like is one of the few decks that seems to be like going even with Lando in a matchup win rate perspective. So I think this deck is valid. I think that you are making a pretty, in my opinion, like ballsy call that like Obi-Wan, you can either fade that deck or like is not a great pick for this event. But if you're a Yularen player, like that is what you're hoping for, or well, I guess I don't want to say you're hoping for it because like if you're confident, like you're just making a strong call, it's not hoping, but like to me it's like hoping because this is not my opinion, but that is a decision that you will have to make based on your analysis of the known information that we have available to us. On the other side of the coin is this Vader guy. Like I don't want to belabor the point. I've said it like time after time after time, but like this guy is a terrorist. Like he hoses Obi-Wan. There's no question about that. But man, this dude's win rate looks horrendous into like most everything else. And that's like typical. Like this is the type of deck that does not tend to do well into the good decks because it's again, it's quite linear. It's quite like specific what it's doing. And as soon as your opponent knows what's up or can answer your thing or has any agency over the game whatsoever, you fold. If they answer your Victor Leader and your Clone Combat Squadron, which are 2 real units, like the game's not winnable. The rest of your deck doesn't do anything. Like, yes, your leader will hit them for some amount of damage eventually, but they're already expecting that because, you know, if their deck is good, it has to live a Boba Fett hit, like most likely. So all of these things in conjunction, this thing is absolutely paper to Obi-Wan's rock, but, you know, the room is not just Obi-Wan. If it were, you would take this deck and you would win every single round, but it's just not the world that we live in. I do not recommend playing this Vader guy. I think he's a really bad answer to the format. I think that, well, maybe this is a better way of saying that. I think that Vader is a fantastic answer to a different format, one that is completely dominated by Obi-Wan and that does not have some of this guy's natural predators in the wild. But that is not the format that we're living in going into London. If something crazy, crazy, crazy happens at London, it could be the format that we're going into looking at Prague, but I don't expect that to be the case. I think that's a pretty unreasonable expectation to have. So on the basis of all of this, I will continue to not recommend that people play Darth Vader. If this is the deck that you play, if this is all that you want to do in your life is play Darth Vader, it's your life. It's a free country. It's a free universe. We have free will. You can do these things. But for these reasons, that's why I don't like this deck. That's why I don't like this as a solution to the format. And that's my way of evaluating something like this, you know, as compared to a Yularen or as compared to an Aurra Data Vault. Those are the types of questions that I'm asking myself when trying to find my strategy or position within the metagame. So in terms of foresight, yes, I'm pretty high on these blue-green villain ideas at the moment. They seem like one of the better responses to Lando Lake Country. Of course, I'm still high on Lando Lake Country itself. I think as a level 1 play, that's pretty great bar. You know, if I were to recommend somebody a deck to play at the London sector, it would be Lando Lake Country. Second to that, like if you're testing, if you don't feel super confident with Lando Lake Country, or if you haven't had a ton of time to play, I think Obi-Wan is a very, very, very valid deck. I think that it's a pretty reasonable deck to pilot as well to a high skill floor, you know. So all these things in conjunction, I'm interested in these blue-green villain ideas as a possible new contender, but nothing at the moment screams to me that they're going to take the London sector by storm. But I do definitely see the angle for Aurra Sing to have a very good showing into that tournament. If it can solve its Obi-Wan problem, if Obi-Wan is even a problem to be solved at all, you know, these are some of the questions that we'll be attempting to verify this week, and those are the things that I'm asking myself. Another thing that I had in mind was this Boba Fett blue idea. I saw this at Atlanta and I kind of liked it. The ups and downs with this deck, you just think about it this way. This is a single reactor ignition deck in the realm of Dedra Miro, but like there's like an actual engine, like an actual deck here. And so you derive some of the advantages of just having a single reactor ignition in your deck with the natural advantages as well of Boba Fett. So what this means is your ability to clear the board is better into Obi-Wan, I believe, and I think definitely better into Lando Lake Country, which is relying on this like snowball ability and this ability to build like an enormous board with spies and rows and liberties on it. And if you're just able to click the single reactor ignition button on 8, reset the board, not die, their ability to get back on the board is a little bit limited. Like, yes, they can go Faith Rose, but like if they have second rows, something else had to have gone your way in the game, you know, you would think over the course of the match. So not always a practical response to just wiping the board. You do burn damage to them. Their board gets very, very wide as well. And then from that position, if you just run out Devastator, you know, you will just burn them to the ground kind of before they have a chance to react. Their ability to respond to a Devastator once they're clear off board is a little bit limited. So anyway, a lot of advantages that I'm seeing with this Boba Fett blue idea. The downside that it has is into the Boba Fett Lake Country deck. You are just, in that matchup, a strictly inferior deck to them, I believe. Like, you have the Nimble Prowess and Hona, but I don't think it swings the matchup over just having 4 more HP. Like, yes, you get a Hona swing, like, big whoop, you healed 2. They started 4 up on you at the beginning of the game. Like, they started with a Devastator hit, you know? Or the Devastator burn damage, not the hit. So anyway, all this to say, this is another deck that I am personally interested in. It hasn't been as verified, and it's like known information in the sense that it was played at the sector and was the best placing Boba Fett at that event. So I would really like to see this deck continue to be explored. I think it was a really cool thing that we ended up seeing. Just another advantage that this deck has in the Lando Lake Country matchup is that Nimble Prowess helps you free trade liberties, which is like incredibly winning. Just having the extra health sometimes gets you over. It's all you need. So all these things in conjunction, I think there's some good things going on with this deck, but it's pretty untested. It's pretty unpopular as for now, but just an idea that I had that I wanted to kind of publicize after the results of Atlanta, and just haven't had the opportunity to since. So anyway, that's all we had for today. A lot that we went to over. We took a couple of weeks off, so kind of crammed everything in this week's meta review. Good luck if you're playing the Atlanta sector. Good luck as well prepping for Prague. Huge shoutouts as always to our sponsors, Rochester CCG, for all of your shiny cardboard needs. You'll see these guys at events. They typically vend in the United States. Go up to them, have a chat. They're nice, they're cool, they rock. As well as Premier Games for all of your premium accessory needs. Please do check out our METAFY for continued discussion on things like the metagame, things like deck's positions, and things like our current testing process. Link is, of course, in the description as always. And thanks for viewing, and I'll catch you on the next.